Welcome to Brain Talk, a program for non-scientists. I am Claire Flaherty, a clinical neuropsychologist in Penn State Health Neurology. I am a brain behavior specialist. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Christopher Nallan. Christopher is a science communicator who served for several years as host of Doc Talk for CBS 21.
And thank you for having me, Dr. Flaherty. It's a privilege to be part of this segment, Brain Talk, as we are going to delve into so many interesting topics. But of course, your first and foremost and most important topic, FTD. So I guess the best thing is to kind of start out with what it is.
So FTD becomes really crucial in discussions about brain behavior relationships because it's the second most common dementia for people under age 65. And really, despite that, very little is known about it. Like Alzheimer's disease, FTD can strike as insidious onset so that people start to have changes where they're just doing a little bit more of what they were always doing, becoming a little more forgetful or a little more distractible in the case of FTD. And it takes a while sometimes. In the case of FTD, it might take the family several years to realize that something is actually clinically wrong. So in the case of FTD, as I'll have you elaborate on as a caregiver, the person's behaviors become problematic because the first sign of the condition is loss of judgment. And usually that's accompanied by a lack of insight. And so a person will start having deterioration of judgment and problem-solving ability without any insight that anything is any different. It's the family around them that realizes something is wrong.
Now, the very interesting thing the first and foremost, obviously, my father, was diagnosed with FTD back in 2017. And he recently passed away from the disease last year. One thing we also noticed too, and from other visits to doctors, and you yourself had elaborated a lot on this too, the misdiagnosis on the disease. What are some of the misdiagnoses? What do people get diagnosed with instead of FTD?
Well, because frontotemporal changes result in changes in behavior, people are often perceived as depressed. And so they may spend a year or two going from the family doctor referral over to a psychiatrist, or they may be seen by counselors. And because of the person's condition, which includes an element of apathy, they will appear with diminished initiative, motivation, drive. They pretty much don't want to do the things they used to love to do. So they may appear to someone as depressed. But if you ask the person, are you depressed? They will tell you no. They just don't really feel like doing these things anymore. That's one of the reasons that there's a delay in recognizing the condition. Another reason is the person has no insight, so they may resist the idea they need to be seen by the doctor. And unless the family members, the spouse or the adult children, are assertive enough to kind of push the issue, they sometimes will just try to accommodate that person and allow them to progress until the point where there's something really significantly in need of being addressed, and then the person gets care. It might be several years after the condition has begun.
Yeah, and I would have to say that's pretty much what happened with my father's situation. So he was diagnosed after we did notice some changes in behavior. There was some forgetfulness, some repetition. He started repeating himself a little bit. That to me was odd, but it was more his compulsive behavior. He did start gambling very heavily, and he would make this a daily occurrence. The second me or my mother would leave the house, he would start doing that. But even before that, when he was still employed, the kind of odd things that he did at work really set him away from others. It made him stand out. People used to think, "What's wrong with Bobby? Why is he Why is he acting strange? He wasn't listening to people. He was surpassing their authority and just doing it anyway. It was rather odd, to say the least. That was in the beginning. Would you say that'd be common in the workplace? Would you notice things in the workplace?
I would. And if a person has a supportive work environment, his coworkers, more so than supervisors, coworkers will often cover for the person. They'll think that person's having a bad day, or they'll just, if they're friends, they might assume something's going on, in their home life, and they'll just try to compensate for the person and try to, in a sense, cover for them. But as I wanted to point out, like in our early conversations when I first met you, when I was working with your dad, it's important for the family to understand that some of the complications that you were experiencing with him are very common. So, for example, most of the families I've worked with who had any kind of means ended up in bankruptcy. There's no way for the family to really know a lot of what's going on, and there's really no good way to control it. By the time it becomes obvious to you and the rest of your family, like your mom in your case, the person's already run up a lot of debt. And that happens in all kinds of situations with all kinds of families. So it's a very common complication.
Yeah, there was a lot of money issues. He did splurge a lot with a credit card or two, to my knowledge. Just endless charging, didn't care. And I want to say though that behavior started before his diagnosis, and that's the other thing too. It's all about timing. Sometimes this can go on for years before you ultimately say, what is he doing? Like, why won't he stop? Is it just something so erratic? Is he just like, you wouldn't think it's dementia. You wouldn't think to go, oh, we need to go to the doctor and get this checked out. You know what I mean?
No, you wouldn't. You would wonder if the person's having well, let me just step back and say this condition is an early onset. So it strikes in midlife. And so the family might think the person's having a midlife crisis. They suddenly want to go out and buy a sports car when they're just making ends meet. And that's really a common occurrence, that people go out and suddenly do something really, some kind of erratic spending. And the family wants to find out, like, what's wrong? Is everything okay? Like, they don't think of it as a medical issue. Think of it more as, like, again, like some kind of an emotional or psychosocial issue, like midlife crisis, or something. Maybe the marriage is having some complications, and whose doesn't, right? Maybe the person is just acting out because of emotional difficulties. But when you try to address it from that approach, then you find that the person either doesn't know what you're talking about, because this is really a medical condition that includes lack of insight. But there really is, when you probe it, when family finally gets to the point where they start asking, like, what's going on, you'll find that there is nothing going on. Person just has simply lost their sense of judgment, and they become somewhat stimulus bound, like they're in the moment, and they will just do what they want. They're back to the instant gratification stage of early life.
Which is what I was getting to next. I feel like the deeper they go into the disease, the more it's like they're stepping backwards in their lifetime. So they're going from, he was diagnosed when he was 67. But I always said to my mother, okay, now that we know his diagnosis and we started talking to you, and thank goodness for all your help, because you gave us that awareness. And then we started paying attention to patterns, which is very important. But it's almost as if, okay, so now dad is in his early 30s. Now he's in his 20s. Now he's a toddler. And when he was a toddler, that was his end point. That was almost his end stage.
Yeah, there's some debate in the field about whether to look at the condition that way, but I would certainly agree that as we are losing the prefrontal lobe capacities, this area of our brain is the last to come up. It really isn't fully matured. It's not finished laying down tracks until we're about 30 years old. If you think about how we move through life in let's say in our culture, our society, we move up and you finish education, you get a job. By around 30 years old, people are pretty well established. They have their position. They might be married. They're starting to raise a family. And then so from 30 to 60, people are then developing their professional skills. They're developing like a sense of social sophistication. They may become a leader in their church, their local community, in the workplace, and they're becoming more able to negotiate and just interact and problem solve. And maybe if they have a managerial role, they're learning again, how to supervise people and effectively. So those are all the things that the prefrontal lobe is involved in and is crucial for. When we start to lose those skills, we go from being what I would call, we go from being ladies and gentlemen to women and men. We kind of lose that social sophistication over time. And as disease advances, so the first thing you'll see is somebody impulsively acting out, somebody blurting out something that's disrespectful or like a crude off-color joke in a situation that doesn't call for it, where they never would have done that before.
Yes.
We all might think these things, but we don't say them. We're diplomatic, and they'll start losing that level of being more sophisticated. And then as the condition advances, they lose the things that we learn as an adolescent, like the impulse control we need in order to maintain our job. Some 16-year-olds, they're actually known for calling in from their job at the local food place because they want to go down the shore for the weekend, and they lose the job. That might happen to somebody 16, but by 26 years old, we don't just call off because we want to go to the beach.
Right.
We maintain our positions, and we have a certain appropriateness, and then that gets lost, and the person becomes more and more stimulus bound and less capable to function socially.
Yeah, I think the oddities that you have to look at too is I find myself going back as far as I can to recollect now, even though he's gone. Now, for my own sake, to start spreading this awareness for others to know and get aware sooner. The sooner you get an idea that something is really going on here, the better off you're going to be with diagnosis, with maybe findings. I'd have to go way back, almost even 6 years prior to his diagnosis, of things that were odd. So I want to say I'm not a neuropsychologist or somebody that has that, knowledge, but I will say my knowledge from my father is he could have had this for 10 years or more.
I think
Is
the
that
typical
possible?
time frame is about 5 years. People can look back 5 years and see that there were subtleties that they just thought the person's having a bad day, and they're being a little more themselves. Nothing that's out of character is happening at that point. They're just being a little more impulsive, a little more. Everybody has idiosyncrasies. We all have flaws. We all have little
Right.
quirks in our personality, and then
Sure.
they become more and more evident. And so, but you're right, it's at least about a 5-year look back. In the Alzheimer's literature, there's a belief, and there's a lot of supportive evidence for the fact that the condition's beginning somewhat 20 years before. Like there's a preclinical stage. And the more that we understand on the molecular level, the more we realize these things are going on for a much longer time period. And then you have that 5-year window when you start to see the changes, but they're still subclinical, but the family is noticing them. And by the time the condition is really obvious to a clinical presentation, they're about 5 to 10 years down the road with the condition. So you're absolutely right. The family sees this first. So I think
Right.
that this is why I think it's really, really important as early as possible that we bring the family and patient into a therapeutic alliance, that you and your dad, in your case, become like really integral to the treatment team, because you are really the ones that are like, you're in the trenches, you're with him 24/7. So you know a lot more than we do as far as the nuances of his condition and how to best treat it. So it works the best for the patient if there is that team approach. And if we catch somebody early enough, in my work, I have found that women tend to maintain their insight longer. I'm not really sure why, but there seems to be some kind of hormonal reasons for those that are really not quite understood just yet. But in the case of somebody who still has some degree of insight, you bring them in as early as possible and explain to them that while they have insight, we really want them to be part of decision making. We don't want them to be down the hall while people are making decisions for them. That usually grabs the patient's attention and gets them involved in making decisions about their own treatment, and
Right.
that which includes reining in their behaviors, including access to finances and access to the car keys.
Yeah, that experience, the car keys, oh, what a memory. I mean, the number of times that we actually had to hide car keys on my father because it was something that he wanted to, he first of all, he got in a car accident on his way back home after running out the door to go to a casino. The irony in that, if you think about it, so here he goes to a casino, but he doesn't make it home. We were going to think about reporting him missing. We didn't hear from him. This was almost a day. We didn't know what to do. So we started having family members go out to the Bronx in New York City to where he was. I mean, and the worst place to go if you have this kind of setup mentally, you're going to be disoriented naturally when you're in New York City sometimes. So to have this kind of disease on top of that, it really didn't end well. And he ended up getting in a car accident. Luckily, we found him. He was okay. His car was totaled, though. That story, another day, but that whole process was just wild. And then he lost his license after that, never got a car back, but it was now hiding the keys from him after that. And then eventually, that became a thing of the past where he almost just forgot about that ambition of going to get the keys. That went away by itself.
Well, you make a really good point, and I wanted to make it clear too that although we're focused on behavior right now, frontotemporal dementia does also involve changes in language. As the condition advances, when somebody presents as behavioral, they will also then start to experience the language changes as well. So over time, in your dad's case, he was less fluent and he was less capable to understand what was being said to him. So even though he had no insight and was giving you stubborn responses early on to his behavioral changes, after a while, you couldn't even communicate your concerns to him very well because he really couldn't understand what was being said. And he also was not really able to communicate his own reactions to things.
Yeah, and we were talking too before, or I think it was just during his, well, when he was diagnosed, but then after when you were doing some studies with him on him, I remember you had mentioned that there were three areas. One is the speech, but then there were two other off, I guess, off spreads or branches off of FTD that people can get. So he had one variant, but there were two others.
Yes, they're language subtypes. There is a semantic disorder, and so you lose your semantics, you lose your understanding of speech, and so you can still speak fluently for quite some time, but you lose your understanding of what words mean. So you're not following people when they speak to you, and also over time, your speech becomes somewhat telegraphic. So and it becomes somewhat hyper focused. It's a person may, for example, if they had an interest in sports cars, they will talk about sports cars and they'll repeat that kind of conversation. We call that perseverating. They'll perseverate on talking about sports cars. Whenever you bring them up, they'll somehow bring the conversation back to that. And they're in a way they're still trying to communicate. When they hit on one of those topics, they're more fluent and they're more understandable. So I think that's part of the reason that they tend to do that. The other is they're just locked in sort of to things that they're hyper focused on. The other condition, the person continues to understand what's said to them longer, but they're losing their fluency. So it's progressive non-fluent aphasia. And that condition leaves a person unable to speak at all over time. And I think it's
So
important to realize one last thing, real quickly, that all dementias, although there are very distinct differences in these conditions, eventually they dovetail down, and when they're advanced, they all look pretty much the same. People lose their capacities overall, and in that case, need intense care.
yeah, that's ultimately what happened. I mean, we had to place him in an assisted living. For a lot of different events rolled out of that, but he did end up in a very good facility in Pennsylvania. And the reason why we also moved him to Pennsylvania, even though that was a jolt for him. We tried our best. The ride here was okay, and I think it's because he was familiar enough with me, and he was safe with me driving. We had him in the front seat, my mother in the back, so we kept him up front to kind of keep him like feeling, like in control in a way. And then we brought him here. It was rough, but at the end of the day, it was the best thing that we could have done because my mother, she was ultimately the caregiver. I was remote and I came back as much as I came to New York, but I said, let's take him here where I live. you need a break, because I thought she was going to just ultimately not, I thought she was going to go past burnout to potentially herself being at a life risk, to be honest. Not taking a life, but herself, but she was exhausted. And I think we don't think about the caregivers. These people, they take us to the level that we never thought we could do.
Well, I think it's important that what you just brought out, because I've been running a group for caregivers for a very long time, and caregivers need encouragement to take care of themselves. Caregivers will experience burnout, like in your mom's case, and in many cases, the adult children like yourself, they step in and say, "Look, we've already lost Dad. We don't want to lose you too. So please
Mhm.
take care of yourself." Caregivers put themselves at risk for strokes, heart attacks, aneurysms. It really can become quite dangerous, as you're pointing out, like in your mom's case, because she was with you out here. There was nobody else there as immediate family, so most of the work, the burden was on her until they came out to Pennsylvania. So you're absolutely
Yeah.
right. They have to take a caregiver really needs coaching and reassurance, and to take care of themselves, because they can't take care of anyone else if they're neglecting themselves.
Yeah. It's like ultimately a seemingly impossible balancing act. And if you make it through it all, let me tell you something. The one thing that we can do now is spread the awareness and help people and coach them on how to get through this horrific disease.
So you bring up something that I'd like you to share your insight with. When you first approached your family doctor and then approached the specialist, how was the reaction? How did you effectively convey that something really needed to be addressed in terms of his behavior?
Uh, well, it was the first person was the neurologist, excuse me. So neurology was the first area, because that's when we knew we brought up the fact that it's just something is off. And it was actually through your help, through a couple of others that other stories we've heard, that maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to get my father scanned, an actual full MRI scan with contrast, specifically to really analyze the brain and see what was going on. And that's when it came back immediately. It said FTD. That's what the scan came back saying, and we're like, what is that? And the neurologist said, well, he has dementia. But then we're like, well, what is the FTD? But then what is that? And she says, I'm honestly not as knowledgeable of what that is.
So that's the state of things today, and you make a really excellent point. Like, the family doctors and neurologists that tend to be more generalists. They're well intended. They're very hardworking. They're very devoted. Passionate people. But this condition is really not that well understood. And I think once you get into the realm of behavior, it seems to be outside of the domain of neurology in many cases. So we have behavioral neurologists, not in every setting. They tend to be in academic settings. And outside of that, if you're speaking to a generalist in in private practice or in the smaller community, they really have little to no knowledge of frontotemporal changes, and they'll tend to think that it's a psychiatric condition. It's
Right.
something to do with something going on in the family system they don't know about, and it's outside their domain.
Yeah. Yeah, it is just it's ever so complex, and even when you have the medical support that you have, even they are lost with the full, like, well, what do we do next? We get that look, and we're like, what? We need more, though. And that's where you came in. Somebody had studied this and 30 plus years. And I think that's the incredible part. If we didn't have you through this entire process, just in general, it would have been 1,000 times harder, because we wouldn't have really taken the necessary steps because we weren't aware. And I think that's the whole point of these videos, or this video specifically today, is just to help those who were going through something so traumatic.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm hoping in future videos that we can possibly bring up a topic for the week. Like, I know that every week there are journals that come out and talk about new advances. And I think that it might be a good idea for us to just continue to look at the current state of affairs and talk about approaches to providing further education, and then keeping up with advances as they come, treatments as well as approaches for quality of life. That will, I think that we'll be able to shed some light on things for everyone, from the caregivers to the generalist, family doctor, as well as a neurologist in the community.
Great.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it was really great meeting with you, and we're going to have many, many, many more topics ahead, and I look forward to that.
Yeah, me as well. Okay.
Thank you.
You're
Till
welcome.
next
Thank
time.
you.